Well, we have come to the 10-year anniversary of Nintendo Power for issue 110 for July of 1998. So we're about, 2008, 2018, plus about 27 years. 27-year anniversary, more or less. Not bad. I'm old. Our cover game this issue is Acclaim's first WWF game for the N64 with WWF Warzone. In the letters column, we have a teacher in Maine who is doing a group playthrough of Final Fantasy III, or Final Fantasy VI as we know it now, with his class. I am interested to know how that worked out, both in terms of logistics, like how far they got with the class, but also if there are any other teachers who have done anything similar. Doesn't have to be Final Fantasy, could be Dragon Quest, any other JRPG, what have you. If you are a teacher or a student of a teacher who did something similar, please hit me up in the comments if you know. In the power charts, GoldenEye still holds the top spot, with Zelda staying strong through the Super Nintendo and Game Boy. Interestingly, the N64 DD is still on the most wanted list, though at this point the accessory's fate has been sealed, especially in the US, and you'd think they'd have just dropped it from the list of things you could vote for, unless it's still persisting as a write-in. We move on to our cover game, WWF Warzone. We have notes on the various gameplay modes, with the mode that would generally become known in conventional wrestling fandom as a hardcore match, being here called a weapons match. We also have the move lists, which use fighting game style button combinations. No signature moves or finishing moves are listed, so we don't have any information on what the button combination is for the stunner, or the stun gun for Austin, or the sweet chin music for HBK. We also get some notes on the Create a Wrestler mode, which has you leveling up your wrestler's stats through play, which means you also only have one slot for Create a Wrestler. Now, WWF Warzone's core problem is that it is trying to replicate the wide range of moves that a pro wrestler can bust out in the course of a single match in the game, and they are trying to do this on the N64 controller. The solution they've decided on how to do this is to try to use fighting game controls to allow for a wide array of moves depending on the relative positions of the wrestlers. It doesn't work. Instead, pulling off really basic moves like a whip requires far more controller inputs than past games have used for the same purpose, and for that matter, that their contemporaries like Aki's WCW games or Humans Fire Pro Wrestling games are using at the same time. It makes Acclaim's wrestling games at this point an evolutionary dead end. Considering that Acclaim would go on to get the ECW license, this is kind of a bummer, because when all is said and done, and in all respects, ECW deserved better, and I don't just mean video games context. We have a continuation of our coverage of Banjo-Kazooie with more of the guide. F-Zero is coming to the N64 with F-Zero X, and we have some notes on the new version of the game, the expanded character roster, and finally having multiplayer. Now, this is out by the time this issue was published, so let's talk about the game. F-Zero X definitely has the advantage of having come out after other futuristic racers, allowing Nintendo to look at games like, Wipeout, and also in turn look back from the original F-Zero and learn what they did while working to maintain what makes F-Zero unique. Consequently, F-Zero X has the sort of Hot Wheels roller coaster-esque track that we got from Extreme G and Wipeout on the PlayStation, only dropping the weapons and putting the focus on the racing. The game plays very well with the good use of inside and outside pipe portions of levels, and all. While I didn't play as well as I'd like with this in my first big run, I had a blast at it, and I'm glad this version is multiplayer for something that would be a shared experience, particularly taking advantage of the fact that the N64 has 4-player controller support built in out of the gate. So, really strong showing here. We move from the arcade version of Mortal Kombat 4 to the home version, with fatality lists and combos, with a K naturally, for various characters, along with their character stories. Mortal Kombat 4's core problem, as with numerous other fighting games we've played on the N64, is that the controller doesn't have the right button layout for fighting games. The A and B buttons are a little too offset from the C buttons for them to work like a proper 6-button controller. Consequently, while I had a pretty good start to the game, I eventually ended up kind of just flailing. In classified information, we have instructions on how to access the debug menu in Shadows of the Empire and in Quake. Midway has a Strike Series-style helicopter action game on the N64 with Chopper Attack. We have maps of levels and notes on enemies. Chopper Attack, in a weird way, feels more user-friendly to play than the Strike game did on the Super Nintendo. If I had to give a specific reason or reasons, the camera perspective plays a lot into that, along with the controls. I think a proper dual-stick controller would, as far as modern dual-stick controller, I should say, would be the preferable way to play this game, or one like it, if should this be remade now. I do think the N64 controller does do a good job of allowing you to move and strafe more easily than you could on the Super Nintendo controller, and certainly than you were on the Genesis controller, the Strike series, while allowing you to quickly aim your autocannon or your target reticle for missile lock on targets. Probably my biggest issues with the game so far is that the lock-on targeting feels sluggish, and there isn't really a good way to deal with somebody else's missile lock on you. It doesn't feel like shooting down the enemy that is targeting you will break the lock, nor can you particularly aim at the missile to try and shoot it down mid-flight, nor are there special maneuvers that you could do to try and otherwise evade that attack. It'd be nice if there was some sort of upgrade path in the game to address this, but that I'm aware is more of a modern game conceit than anything else. Considering that no sequels were made and developer Seta no longer exists, I wouldn't mind seeing how later developers have played with the concept, if not with some sort of spiritual sequel, not using the Strike isometric perspective, but rather this particular behind-the-back arcade view. We briefly step into Game Boy coverage with a look at Harvest Moon GB. I haven't covered this particular version of Harvest Moon yet, so I might as well take a quick look. Well, I came into Harvest Moon for the Game Boy, somewhat concerned that the game's reduced camera perspective because of the Game Boy screen would make it a little difficult to play, since so much of the game is dependent on time management and figuring out pathing to most efficiently grow crops to earn money to expand your farm. I'm glad to say that that was not an issue. I was able to keep track of the general position of where I am in respective to everything else on the farm and where everything is, and if I had an issue, it's that the game is not clear about what I need to do in order to, say, upgrade my axe in order to clear stumps, since a lot of the environments are less visible, particularly since the main part of the Harvest Goddess Spring is less accessible because it's a giant rock in the way. Town is reduced to a mini-map or a menu rather than being able to navigate it, and a lot of the spots in between home and town aren't really present as much. Although as far as the main series goes, I think I'm more interested in playing some of the more recent titles, or for that matter Stardew Valley, but I do think this game did a good job of setting up this franchise, and it's perfectly playable on the go, and I think it honestly kind of hooked me in more than the original version of the game did. After our brief handheld detour, we return to the N64 with a Mission Impossible licensed game over a year after the movie came out. We even get a guide for the whole game. Mission Impossible has a core problem that keeps it from being a hidden gem of the N64's library: the camera controls. Now, honestly, part of this is to a certain degree an issue of the era of getting the hang of third-person 3D camera controls, but also this legitimately feels like a situation where I feel like I would prefer and enjoy the PlayStation 1 version of the game more than the N64 version, because with the N64 version, when I want to tilt the camera to look around corners and see where enemies are, which is what you need to do for a stealth game, I have to take my hand off the movement controls and move it to the D-pad. Whereas, hopefully, if they did this right on the PlayStation 1 version, it's just like R1, R2, or L1, R1, or R2, L2, something like that, to just rotate the camera. That said, the core concept of this game is solid. You play as Ethan Hunt in the IMF with a lead-up tutorial mission that serves as a cold open, no pun intended, it's in Scandinavia, before getting into the mission that kicks off the movie, the attempt to steal the knock list, which ultimately goes horribly wrong, and kicks off the trend of Ethan Hunt being framed for having gone rogue and thus having to actually go rogue and operate outside of the confines of the IMF. It's just that the combined camera and movement controls just don't quite work right on the N64 controller, and that's combined with some general clunkiness involving communicating guard locations and vision cones, and having some improvements there would do a lot to make the game more playable. Again, this is a game that could really benefit from having a modern spiritual sequel or an HD remake made with lessons learned from the development of modern controllers. Also, while I am pumped for the new Bond game coming out from IO Interactive, I found myself coming out of this game wanting them to do a Mission Impossible game. In fact, wanting that more than I want a Bond game. And I like James Bond. I like Bond movies. I like Bond games. So that is kind of weird to get that in hindsight. We have another baseball game for the N64, Mike Piazza's Strike Zone. This game has league and team creational options, but it doesn't appear to control as well. They say outright in the guide, which is not a point in the game's favor. Mike Piazza's Strike Zone is interesting is that it takes a lot of the nuts and bolts and the fine manipulation out of your pitcher-batter duel. There's no choosing as the batter to swing low or high based on where you think the pitch is going. The batter always swings at the right height, it's just a matter of getting the timing. Instead, the game puts a lot of focus on fielding, getting your fielders in the right spot. It's an interesting choice considering that the game has the name of the pitcher in the title, and in particular draws attention to the whole concept of the pitcher-batter duel. Otherwise, it is interesting that one of the things the game does is that when you select your pitch, if the pitcher doesn't like it, presumably determined by their stats, he'll shake his head, asking you to choose something else. It is interesting for the game to more explicitly put your pitch calling in the context of the player controlling not the pitcher directly, but the catcher sending signals. It makes for a nice touch. We have a guide for the N64's We Have RPGs at Home game, Quest 64, with the guide for a chunk of the early game. The core issue with Quest 64 is that it is a game that mechanically is about 9 to 10 years out of date as of when this issue came out. It's grindy like Dragon Quest I, a game that had glacially slow pacing as you went through the grind for cash for better gear and enough healing items to help you make it to the next town, plus of course the levels and with them stat increases to also help you get on your way. The problem is Quest 64 doesn't really have money, nor does it have gear. It has healing items and return items you can pick up on your journey. It also has some problems with the camera, but admittedly that's in ways that are not uncommon for games in 1998. Additionally, for that whole 10 years out of date thing, it has the Final Fantasy II, not 2 US, aka Final Fantasy IV for the Super Nintendo, Final Fantasy II for the Famicom leveling up system. You level up hit points and defense by taking damage. Also, you have no armor to equip, so it's just strictly by taking damage. You level up your MP by casting spells. You level up your agility, which handles things like evasion, accuracy, turn order, and movement, so a lot of important stuff, by running around in your hex on the battle map during combat. It makes for a weird situation where Quest 64 becomes a game where the best way to play it is basically put on a podcast with some music, or if you're emulating it or on a dual monitor setup or whatever, put on a YouTube video on a second monitor and grind up some levels until the monsters in this area of the map are less challenging, and then move on to the next town. In other words, it's perfect for Nintendo Switch Online. It's perfect for emulation on the Steam Deck or a similar device. It's perfect for a mister while you play podcasts at your stereo. What it's not perfect for is on a physical cartridge for the N64 in 1998. This makes for something of a weird bummer. The game is weirdly ahead of its time because it's almost perfect for passive second screen or mildly active second screen entertainment. I wasn't expecting to find anything like that here. Even the backhanded manner for a game that's a good idle game, but I'm glad to be weirdly wrong. Again, I can't give it a full-throated recommendation, but it's better than I expected it to be. In Counselor's Corner, we also, speaking of Quest 64, have some tips for it, along with some information how to find secret rooms. We have the Nintendo Power 10-year anniversary special, and what a long, strange trip it's been. We have a month-by-month rundown of the past 10 years of Nintendo Power, covering each issue of the magazine, along with world events contemporaneous with that issue's release. Obviously, of course, third-party and rival consoles aren't mentioned very much. Bust-A-Move 2 has been ported from arcades to the N64, so let's take a look at its N64 release. We have notes on game modes and mechanics. Now, Bust-A-Move 2, aka Puzzle Bobble, remains what it is, Bust-A-Move/Puzzle Bobble. It is a solid port of the game to the N64, and the graphics and controls work really well, though I'd say I prefer to use the D-pad rather than the analog stick, as it provides a level of granularity and precision that the game needs. Our last game of the issue is All-Star Baseball 99 for the Game Boy, which it's a Game Boy port of an N64 game, and I generally skip Game Boy baseball games because the screen is too small to properly handle the gameplay, particularly for fielding, so skip. In the Now Play, no also-rans, and they're also not happy with Mike Piazza's Strike Zone or Quest 64. And in Pak Watch, they discussed the first AIAS, or later DICE Awards at E3, which I think may be archived on YouTube, so I'll see if I can find those and drop a link in the show notes. They focus exclusively on Nintendo's wins because it's the 1990s, and as far as Nintendo is concerned, they are literally the only game console that exists, and PCs maybe matter a little, probably, but not really. And this kind of applies to all the rest of Nintendo's E3 coverage as well. As far as Nintendo Power is concerned, E3 is just an extension of Space World. My pick for the issue is F-Zero X, so I'm going to admit that I very nearly picked Chopper Attack for as my pick of the issue. In fact, I think I'm going to tweak my peaks a little bit here to having like the major pick, as much as I used to with the NES, where I'd have your, like, this is like the Hall of Famer part of the canon pick, and then the hidden gem that's worth seeking out. Similar thing here. F-Zero X. If you have an N64, this really merits a place in your library. But I would also add Chopper Attack as kind of a hidden gem of the console. The third thing I'm going to do, because since we're starting to hit a point now where we're starting to get multi-console ports. I mean, we had this already with Mortal Kombat 4, where it's already had a PlayStation 1 port at this point. And when those come up, I will start saying, hey, if this game is actually pretty good, but maybe play on a different console. I'm definitely going to say that for Mission Impossible. I'm a little hit or miss with Mortal Kombat 4 because that port did have some loading and seek issues with the with that game as going between levels and that sort of thing. So hit or miss on that in terms of maybe do it on a Polymega or something else where it's just copied to the hard drive, or do it via emulation, or for that matter, I think the load times are faster are faster also on the PlayStation 3 and the PlayStation 2 if you're using PS1 games on that. Otherwise, like, I enjoyed Harvest Moon on the Game Boy, but the way I play Game Boy games is an analog pocket, and that does Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance games. So if I was going to use that for a Harvest Moon game, I'd probably pick one of the GBA games instead. Now, next month, I'm holding out for a Bomberman Hero.
Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe. Also consider backing my Patreon. Patreon backers get episodes up to 1 week early of this show and any future Let's Plays. Also, please consider backing my Ko-fi. Toss me a few bucks also helps support the show, and it's not a monthly obligation or anything like that.